And he also quoted Gideon. When the people came to Gideon and he was saying they wanted him to rule over them. And he says, I'm not going to rule over you, and neither will my sons, but God is going to rule over you. So that, the early Israelites, and we're going to go into a quote from Lord Acton, the early Israelites had a federation, a loose federation based upon law, but they didn't have an absolute sovereign authority ruling over them other than God. And there was, until they eventually got themselves a king. But it was this period of the time of the judges. Actually, in principle, it started before then. It started at the time of the elders during the wilderness period, where Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, said, take ye these wise men and make... And because, see, Moses was judging these cases directly. Everybody was coming to him. He was making these... And Jethro says to him, what is this thing you're doing? And he says, the people are coming to me and I'm judging them. Well, it's not a good thing. It's going to wear you out. It's going to wear your people out. So they need to take you wise men of, good sound character, and I'll make them rulers over you. So they set up a system of elders, and it was a loose federation. And when they went into Canaan, it expanded and then became under the judges. And you had this federation, family-based, tribal-based federation of quasi-independent tribal families ruled under this document. These you had the Ten Commandments, but you had the Mosaic Law, which is loosely, a lot of this was described in Deuteronomy, but it was based upon the rule of law. And many people are saying, well, okay, Thomas Paine, he wasn't Christian, he was more secular, he probably didn't believe this. Well, whether or not he believed it is not an issue. The issue is that he knew his audience. And in order to get a hearing for his argument among his audience, he makes this reference because that is how ingrained this thinking was in the colonies at that time, because it was being preached from the pulpit, it was being taught in the schools, it was being taught in the law schools, it was permeated the culture to such an extent that he knew if he wanted to get a hearing for his thinking that he had to refer to what the people were justifying their rebellion against monarchical authority based upon, and this was what it was based upon. Now, this brings up a question as to okay, you give your authority to rule over you, your consent. Now, the state as an institution is the only institution in society is based upon the legal use of force, the justified use of force. And so when the state makes a decision, okay, you consent to have someone represent you, but when the state makes a decision, like for instance, you're going to pay X number of amount in taxes, and you decide you don't want to do that, you don't have a say there. There is no consent. The state is the only institution in society that's based upon the justified use of force. So there is no consent. So the question is then, how does this square? Okay, we give our authority, our consent for others to rule over us. But what about in situations that we are not consenting to? Is it still based upon the consent of the government? Is the institution? And this was a serious question. If you took this seriously, then is an institution that is based upon the justified use of force legitimate? And some people are saying, well, it's legitimate there in the Bible because the Israelites set up this institution. And so therefore it's, and I've heard a lot of people say this, but if you read carefully the Bible, they set up a representative government where people were governed. They were being governed by the rule of law. But is that the same thing as what we call the state, the modern institution of the state today? And I don't think so. And I want to go into the difference as to what I see the difference is. The first quote is from British historian Lord Acton, who lived during the 19th century. He was one of the ones who came to America for this pilgrimage to study this experiment in ordered liberty. And he wrote a couple of essays. He wrote a lot of things, but there was 2 essays that he wrote. One is called The History of Freedom in Antiquity, and one is called The History of Freedom in Christianity. And in The History of Freedom in Antiquity, he talks about the Jewish experiment. He talks about the Greek democracy and the Roman Republic. But this is what he said about the Jewish experiment and a tribal federation. The government of the Israelites was a federation held together by no political authority, but by the unity of race and faith, and founded not on physical force, but on voluntary covenant. The principle of self-government was carried not only in each tribe, but in every group of at least 120 families, and there was neither rank or privilege, nor inequality before the law. So they had some form of government, but they didn't have a police state. They didn't have an institution that had the monopoly on the justified use of force. If you study the book of Judges, whenever someone who was raised up as a judge to be a ruler in the society, give you an example, they didn't have institutional authority over the people. The people either rejected them or accepted them. Many times rejected them. And they didn't, okay, you're in this position, now you have authority. And we're going to have the police in order to impose that authority. They didn't have that. They recognized, the authority that the judges had was that the people had recognized them as speaking for God. And so they had the authority of persuasion, of principle, but they didn't have the authority of force. And this is a distinction not lost on a lot of people throughout in Judeo-Christian history. And so there's a tension going on here. You also have, if that wasn't taking the issue far enough, you have in Jeremiah talking about the new covenant. And in the new covenant, he's going to write, God says, I will write my law upon your heart. So you have a rule, you have a federation, a family-based federation is based upon the rule of law where they have it written in tablets of stone. They have the written law that tells them what the principles are, but they don't have an institution based upon force. Well, if that wasn't loose enough, they're looking to a day to realize a new covenant where the law would be written in their heart. In other words, they would each have this direct, intimate relationship with God. And they wouldn't even need this tablets of stone, not to mention some authority ruling over them. And that's essentially what the Christians believed Jesus had come to establish, this new covenant. And one example of that is where he has this woman brought to him, where the woman had engaged in adultery. And the Mosaic law had called for stoning in the case of adultery. So Jesus says to the woman, he says to the people there, they brought him there to test him. Now, why were they testing him? They're testing him because he had a reputation for, in many situations, he strengthened the moral law, but he weakened the enforcement of it, so in other words, it says in the Bible that he talks about lust. If you have lust for another, you have. Well, even if you look at a person in lust, that is adultery. So adultery is not just something physical. So in many situations, it's not just a physical act. Even if you look at someone in lust, that is adultery. So in many situations, in terms of the inner meaning of it, he actually strengthened it, made it stricter. But the external enforcement of it, he loosened up. And so he had a reputation among some of the more strict adherents to the law as being loose, playing fast and loose with the law. And that's why they're coming to test him.